My son slid a folder across my dining table and said, "Mom, I need my inheritance now." I stared at him, certain I had misunderstood. But Brandon had already calculated the value of my home, my retirement savings, my late husband's investments, even the lakeside cabin I had never offered to sell. "You're 67, he said coldly. "What are you saving it for? I'm your only child. It will all be mine eventually." Inside the folder was a document that would place a lien on my house and transfer the cabin into his control. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I simply told him I would think about it. That night, after he left, I opened my estate binder, found one name, and quietly picked up a pen. Before I tell you what I changed, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. And tell me in the comments, what would you have said if your own child demanded your inheritance while you were still alive? I'd also love to know where you're watching from and what time it is there. Sometimes, knowing we're sharing this story together makes the difficult parts a little easier to tell. My name is Caroline Hughes, and until a few months ago, I believed I understood the difference between losing a husband and losing a family. I was wrong. Losing my husband, Michael, had broken my heart. Losing my son while he was still alive broke something even deeper. I am 67 years old and have lived in the same brick house on the west side of Columbus, Ohio for more than 35 years. The maple tree Michael planted the summer we moved in now stretches higher than the roof. Every fall, its leaves blanket the front yard in brilliant shades of gold and crimson. Every year, I rake those leaves myself, not because I have to, but because it reminds me that some things are worth caring for, simply because they've stood beside you through every season. Michael and I never considered ourselves wealthy. He worked as an accountant for a regional insurance company for almost 40 years. I spent my career as a public school librarian. Children often imagined librarians had magical lives surrounded by books. But the truth was much simpler. My days were filled with helping nervous first graders sound out words, encouraging shy teenagers to discover novels they never expected to love, and reminding children that stories could carry them through almost anything. Neither of our careers made us rich, but they gave us stability. Every paycheck meant another mortgage payment, another contribution to retirement, another deposit into savings, another promise to ourselves that one day we wouldn't become a burden to anyone. Michael believed in quiet planning. He used to smile whenever friends bragged about expensive vacations or luxury cars. "We don't have to impress strangers," he'd tell me while balancing our monthly budget at the kitchen table. "We only have to protect our future." At the time, I thought he worried too much. Now I realize he wasn't protecting our money. He was protecting our dignity. By the time we both retired, our mortgage was completely paid off. We had respectable retirement accounts, modest investments, and enough savings to enjoy a peaceful life without constantly worrying about bills. The cabin was different. That little place near Hocking Hills wasn't something we bought. It had belonged to my older sister, Rebecca, who died from breast cancer nearly 15 years ago. She never had children. Before she passed away, she placed the keys in my hand and said, "Promise me, this place will always stay with someone who understands memories can't be sold." I promised her. Michael promised her too. Every anniversary after that, we spent a weekend there together. No television, no phones. Just coffee on the porch every morning while mist drifted across the lake. Those weekends became even more precious after Michael's heart began slowing him down. He never complained, not once, even after his first surgery, even after the medications multiplied, even after walking from the cabin to the dock left him short of breath. 3 years ago, I sat beside his hospital bed holding the same hand that had held mine for 43 years. His last words weren't dramatic. He simply looked at me with tired blue eyes and whispered, "You'll be okay." Then he smiled, and he was gone. For months afterward, I wasn't sure he had been right. Brandon had helped me through those first difficult weeks. At least that's what I believed. He came by every Saturday. He mowed the lawn. He carried heavy grocery bags into the kitchen. He fixed a broken porch light without my asking. He even insisted on changing the batteries in every smoke detector because, as he joked, Dad would haunt me if I forgot. Those moments comforted me. They convinced me Michael had been right. I wasn't alone. Brandon was my only child. When he was little, he had the sweetest heart. He loved visiting my library after school. While other boys rushed outside to play basketball, Brandon would help me shelve returned books. He wasn't always patient. Sometimes he'd stack mysteries beside science fiction or children's books among biographies. I'd laugh, and he'd grin before correcting his mistakes. When he was 12, another boy mocked my old station wagon in the school parking lot. Brandon stood in front of me with his tiny fists clenched. "Don't make fun of my mom," he shouted. "She works harder than your parents." I cried all the way home that afternoon. Not because someone insulted our car, because my son had defended me without hesitation. Where had that little boy gone? Sometimes I ask myself that question over and over. There wasn't one dramatic moment when Brandon changed. It happened slowly. After college, he started a construction business renovating older homes. He worked incredibly hard. Michael admired that determination. When Brandon married Vanessa, we welcomed her warmly. She was intelligent, polished, and ambitious. She loved designer handbags, luxury hotels, exclusive restaurants. None of those things bothered me. People have different dreams. But over time, I noticed something else. Vanessa measured success by appearances: a larger house, a newer SUV, more expensive vacations, a bigger client list. Every conversation somehow returned to money. Not enough of it, or not enough compared to someone else. Brandon gradually started speaking the same way. Instead of telling me about projects he was proud of, he told me how much competitors earned. Instead of talking about happy customers, he complained about clients who negotiated lower prices. Instead of asking how I was doing, he asked how the stock market had performed. The changes were subtle enough that I ignored them. Until recently. When Brandon sat across from me that Sunday evening with the folder in his hands, he insisted his company faced only a temporary cash flow problem. "It's nothing permanent, Mom," he said. "We're waiting on payments from 2 major developments." Vanessa nodded immediately. "If we can just get through the next few months, everything will recover." They spoke confidently, professionally, prepared. Brandon explained that several investors had become impatient. Some subcontractors wanted payment earlier than expected. Banks had tightened lending requirements. He insisted the business itself remained healthy. "I just need flexibility." Those were his exact words. Flexibility. Not charity, not help, not a loan. Flexibility. Then he pointed toward my house. "You have more than enough." I remember staring at him, not because of what he said, but because of how easily he said it. As though 40 years of sacrifice could be summarized by a few numbers on a spreadsheet. As though the memories inside these walls had market value instead of emotional value. As though the cabin where Michael scattered Rebecca's ashes was simply another asset waiting to be leveraged. That was the first time I looked at my own son and felt like he was evaluating me the same way an appraiser evaluates a property. Not as his mother, as an opportunity. And once that thought entered my mind, I couldn't force it to leave. Even after Brandon hugged me goodbye that evening. Even after Vanessa smiled politely at the front door. Even after their car disappeared down the street. Something inside me whispered that the son I'd spent a lifetime trusting had already begun counting what he believed would soon belong to him. I just didn't yet understand how much he already knew. The next morning, I carried Brandon's folder into my kitchen and placed it beside my first cup of coffee. I didn't open it immediately. Instead, I sat quietly listening to the familiar sounds outside my window. A neighbor walked his golden retriever. The mail truck stopped 2 houses away. Somewhere in the distance, a lawnmower hummed across the neighborhood. Everything looked ordinary, but nothing inside my home felt ordinary anymore. For 43 years, Michael and I had started nearly every morning at the same kitchen table. Coffee first, newspaper second. Conversation always came before either. Now there was only silence, and a folder my own son had prepared as though he were negotiating with a stranger. I finally opened it. The first page wasn't a letter. It was a spreadsheet. Across the top were neat columns labeled property estimated market value, outstanding debt, and transfer recommendation. I felt my stomach tighten. The first line listed my home. Estimated value $642,000. The number startled me. Michael and I had purchased this house for less than $90,000 in the late 1980s. We never imagined it would be worth anything close to that amount. The second line listed my retirement accounts. The balance wasn't exact, but it was close enough to make my hands tremble. The third page estimated my investment portfolio. Again, not perfect, but frighteningly accurate. Then I reached the page that hurt the most. Hughes family cabin, estimated value $418,000, recommended transfer immediate. I closed my eyes. Rebecca's cabin, reduced to another line on a spreadsheet. There was no mention of memories, no mention of family, no mention of promises, only dollars. I kept reading. Near the back of the folder was a proposed family financial assistance agreement. That title almost made me laugh. Almost. The document sounded generous at first. Brandon would temporarily manage the cabin. I would protect the property from future tax burdens. He would assist me with long-term estate planning. But the legal language underneath told a completely different story. If I signed the agreement, ownership of the cabin could eventually pass into Brandon's control. Even worse, the document authorized placing a lien against my home as collateral for a business loan. I wasn't a lawyer, but I knew enough to recognize danger. Michael had always insisted we both understand every financial document before signing anything. Never trust the summary, he'd say. Read the fine print. That habit may have saved me. I read every page twice. The more I read, the clearer I became. None of this had been thrown together overnight. Someone had spent weeks preparing these papers. Maybe months. Brandon hadn't arrived at Sunday dinner hoping for a conversation. He had arrived expecting a signature. I was still staring at the last page when my phone rang. Vanessa. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail. Instead, I answered. "Good morning, Caroline," she said brightly. She almost never called me Caroline. Usually I was simply Mom. "I hope Brandon didn't upset you yesterday." I think upset is the wrong word. "Oh." I was surprised. There was a brief silence, then her voice softened. "You know how much pressure he's under?" "I know that's what he says." "It's true." She sighed dramatically. "I've never seen him so worried." I didn't respond. She continued anyway. "The company is growing so quickly that cash flow has become difficult." Growing. That wasn't the word Brandon had used. Interesting. "If you could just help him now," Vanessa said, "everything would work out." "I already helped him." "What do you mean?" "Michael and I paid for his college. We helped with the down payment on your first house. We watched Emily every weekend while you built your careers. We've helped plenty." Another pause. Then came the sentence that stayed with me for days. "This is different." "How?" "Because eventually all of this belongs to Brandon anyway." She said it so naturally, so casually, as though my life had already ended. as though I were simply occupying property that technically belonged to someone else. I looked around my kitchen. The curtains I'd sewn myself. The dining table Michael had refinished one summer. The photographs lining the hallway. Did she truly believe these things were already hers to claim? "I'm still alive," I said quietly. "I know that. But you have to think about family." I am thinking about family." She didn't answer immediately. When she finally spoke, her tone had changed. "You know Brandon will be the one taking care of you someday." The sentence sounded caring, but underneath it was something else, a warning, as though my future depended upon my willingness to cooperate. "I appreciate your concern. I just don't want you making decisions you'll regret." "Neither do I." Those words remained in my head after the call ended. Making decisions you'll regret. Who exactly was she talking about? Me or Brandon? By noon, I had decided I needed answers from someone I trusted. I drove to Richard Bennett's office. Richard had managed Michael's retirement planning for more than 20 years. I wasn't just our financial advisor. He had attended Michael's funeral. He knew our family. When I walked into his office, he smiled warmly. "Caroline, it's good to see you." "I wish it were under happier circumstances." His smile faded immediately. "What happened?" I handed him Brandon's folder. Richard spent several minutes reading quietly. Occasionally he frowned. Occasionally he adjusted his glasses. Finally, he looked up. "Did Brandon prepare this?" "I believe so." He tapped the pages thoughtfully. "These property estimates are surprisingly accurate." "That's exactly what worries me." Richard leaned back in his chair. "Has anyone besides you ever had access to your financial records?" "No." "What about online accounts?" "I've always handled them myself." He nodded. Then he turned toward his computer. "Let me check something." Several minutes passed. He scrolled through security logs I couldn't understand. Suddenly, he stopped. "That's interesting." "What?" "About 6 weeks ago, someone contacted our office requesting information about your investment accounts." I felt my heartbeat quicken. "Who?" "They identified themselves as someone helping you organize estate documents. My office requested verification. They couldn't provide everything we required. So, we refused." "Did they leave a name?" Richard shook his head. "No." "But they knew your full legal name. They knew your previous address before you bought your current house. They knew your birthday." "And," he hesitated, "they knew the last 4 digits of your social security number." I stared at him. Only a handful of people knew those details. Richard continued. "Whoever called wasn't guessing. They had personal information. Enough to sound convincing." My throat suddenly felt dry. "Did they ask about anything specific?" "Mostly retirement balances. They also asked whether your trust had been updated recently." That question hit me harder than anything else. My trust. Very few people even knew I had one. Michael, Richard, our attorney, and family. I looked down at Brandon's folder again. The spreadsheets, the estimates, the prepared legal documents. For the first time, a frightening possibility entered my mind. Maybe Sunday dinner hadn't been the beginning of this story. Maybe it had been the final step in a plan that had already been unfolding behind my back for weeks, or even months. I thanked Richard and walked slowly back to my car. As I unlocked the driver's door, I caught my reflection in the window. I looked tired, older than I remembered. Not because of my age, because something far more painful had begun settling into my heart. Trust doesn't disappear all at once. It cracks. Quietly. Almost invisibly. Until one day, you realize you've been standing on broken glass the entire time, and I was beginning to suspect that someone very close to me had been breaking it piece by piece. I just didn't know how much further they were willing to go. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Brandon's spreadsheet. Not because of the numbers, because of the certainty behind them. He hadn't estimated my future. He had planned for it. The following Tuesday was our usual grocery day. For nearly 3 years after Michael passed away, Brandon had driven me to the supermarket every Tuesday morning. I could still drive perfectly well, but he always insisted. "You shouldn't have to carry heavy bags by yourself, Mom." It had become our routine. We'd stop at the bakery first, argue playfully over which bread tasted better, then have coffee before heading home. I found myself smiling as I remembered those mornings. Maybe Sunday had simply been a terrible misunderstanding. Maybe the pressure from his business had pushed him into saying things he didn't truly mean. I wanted to believe that. At 10 o'clock, I was dressed and waiting near the front window. By 10:15, he still hadn't arrived. I checked my phone. Nothing. At 10:30, I finally called him. The call went straight to voicemail. "Hi, sweetheart," I said after the beep. "I just wanted to make sure everything's okay. Give me a call when you can." I waited another 30 minutes. Still nothing. By noon, I drove myself to the grocery store. It wasn't the shopping that hurt. It was realizing that for the first time in years, Brandon hadn't even bothered to cancel. That evening, he finally sent a text. "Busy today. Maybe next week." No apology, no explanation. Just 6 words. I stared at the message for several minutes before locking my phone. Maybe he really was busy. Business owners have difficult weeks. I told myself not to overreact. But that Tuesday became the beginning of a pattern. The Saturday morning phone calls stopped. The surprise visits disappeared. Birthdays, anniversaries, and small family traditions suddenly became inconvenient. Whenever I reached out, Brandon answered hours later or not at all. Vanessa didn't respond even once. The silence grew louder every week. Then something even stranger happened. I tried calling my granddaughter. Emily had always been close to me. When she was little, she'd spend weekends baking cookies in my kitchen while Michael taught her how to fish at the cabin. Even after graduating college, she never forgot my birthday. She sent handwritten cards, not text messages, real cards, with stamps. That was Emily. Thoughtful, old-fashioned, kind. I dialed her number, voicemail. I left a cheerful message. No reply. I tried again 2 days later. Voicemail again. Another message. Nothing. After the 4th unanswered call, I began wondering if something had happened. I sent a text. "Hi, sweetheart. Just checking on you. Love you." It showed as delivered, but never read. That wasn't like Emily. Not even a little. I convinced myself she must be traveling for work. Or maybe she'd changed phone numbers. There had to be a reasonable explanation. Didn't there? About 2 weeks later, I attended my cousin Janet's 65th birthday dinner. Nearly 30 relatives gathered at a local Italian restaurant. Normally, family dinners made me happy. This one didn't. The moment Brandon and Vanessa walked in, several relatives surrounded them. I noticed Brandon hugging everyone warmly, laughing, smiling. He looked like the same son I remembered. For one hopeful second, I thought perhaps everything had returned to normal. Then I overheard my Aunt Louise speaking quietly to another cousin. "I'm worried about Caroline." "So am I. Brandon says she's becoming forgetful." Forgetful? I froze. The 2 women noticed me approaching and immediately changed the subject. Throughout dinner, similar conversations drifted toward me before stopping abruptly. Keeps forgetting conversations. Won't listen to anyone. I felt as though everyone knew something about me that I didn't know myself. Halfway through the meal, Brandon stood to make a toast. He thanked Janet for bringing the family together. Everyone applauded. Then he smiled toward me. "You know," he joked, "seeing everyone together reminds me that Mom's living all alone in that giant house." A few people chuckled politely. He continued, "She's got 4 empty bedrooms, enough savings to outlive all of us, and she still refuses to let anyone help." Louder laughter. My cheeks burned. "I keep telling her she should simplify her life." Vanessa nodded dramatically. "Older people sometimes get emotionally attached to things they don't really need." Someone across the table asked, "Have you considered downsizing?" Before I could answer, Brandon replied for me. "I've tried. But she's incredibly stubborn. I worry she'll make bad financial decisions." Several relatives turned toward me with sympathetic smiles. Not supportive smiles. Pity. As though I were becoming someone incapable of taking care of herself. I finally spoke. "I'm doing just fine." "Of course you are, Mom." His voice sounded gentle, almost loving, which somehow made it worse. "It's just that sometimes we all need help." The conversation moved on, but I couldn't taste another bite of food. After dinner, while everyone gathered near the parking lot, I walked toward the building to retrieve my coat. The restaurant hallway was quiet. As I approached the entrance, I heard voices coming from around the corner. Vanessa and Brandon. "She'll never agree voluntarily," Vanessa whispered. "Then we'll have to show everyone she isn't thinking clearly." My heart stopped. "What about the evaluation?" Brandon asked. "It's almost arranged." "Evaluation? What if she refuses?" Vanessa laughed softly. "She won't have much choice once people start noticing." I stepped backward before they could see me. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped my purse. I waited several moments before returning outside, pretending I hadn't heard anything. The drive home felt longer than usual. Rain had started falling. Windshield wipers moved back and forth in perfect rhythm, but my thoughts were anything but orderly. Evaluation. What evaluation? Medical, financial, psychological? Why would anyone arrange an evaluation without telling me? When I reached home, I walked from room to room, turning on lights I didn't need. The house suddenly felt enormous, empty. For the first time since Michael died, I locked every door before sunset. Not because I feared strangers, because I no longer knew whether I could trust my own family. The following morning, I called my family doctor, Dr. Laura Mitchell. "Have I missed an appointment?" I asked. "No." "Has anyone contacted your office asking about my health?" She hesitated. "Why do you ask?" I explained only enough to make my concern clear. She became unusually quiet. Then she said something that chilled me. "Caroline, someone did call last week asking general questions about cognitive assessments for older adults." My grip tightened around the phone. "Did they identify themselves?" "They said they were a concerned family member. I couldn't discuss your medical information, of course. But they wanted to know what signs would justify further evaluation?" I closed my eyes. "So someone is asking whether I'm losing my mind. I'm afraid someone was asking questions." Dr. Mitchell paused before continuing. "If you ever feel pressured regarding your medical decisions, please tell me immediately." "I will." After hanging up, I sat alone in my living room. The grandfather clock Michael inherited from his father ticked steadily beside the fireplace. Tick-tick, time had always moved forward. But suddenly, it felt as though someone was trying to rush mine. Not toward death, toward dependency, toward doubt, toward a version of me that needed permission to control my own life. I looked around the room Michael and I had built together. Every photograph, every book, Every piece of furniture carried a memory. And somewhere outside these walls, my own son was quietly convincing people that I could no longer be trusted to protect any of it. For the first time, I realized this wasn't only about money anymore. It was about something far more dangerous. Someone was preparing to convince the world that I was no longer capable of speaking for myself. And if that happened, they wouldn't need my signature at all. The knock came just after 9 on a Thursday morning. I had just finished watering the flowers on my front porch when I saw a white sedan pull into my driveway. A woman in navy blue scrubs stepped out carrying a leather clipboard and a tablet. She smiled politely as she walked toward my front door. Mrs. Caroline Hughes. Yes. My name is Nancy Foster. I'm with Central Ohio Home Wellness Services. I frowned. I believe there's been a mistake. She glanced down at her paperwork. I have an appointment scheduled for a home safety and cognitive assessment. I don't. She looked confused. It was arranged by your son. My stomach tightened. My son, Brandon Hughes. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Nancy seemed genuinely uncomfortable. I was told your family had concerns about your memory and your ability to live independently. The words landed like stones in my chest. My family, she nodded sympathetically. They requested an evaluation so we could recommend any services that might help. I stepped onto the porch and gently closed the screen door behind me. I'm sorry you drove all the way here. But I never requested this evaluation. And I certainly didn't authorize anyone else to request it on my behalf. Nancy immediately lowered her clipboard. I understand. I don't want to cause any distress. I'll simply note that the appointment was declined. Before leaving, she hesitated. For what it's worth. Yes. You don't appear confused to me. I managed a small smile. I appreciate that. After she drove away, I remained standing on the porch. The neighborhood looked exactly as it always had. Children waited for the school bus. A jogger passed wearing bright orange headphones. Someone across the street waved. I waved back automatically. Inside, however, I felt as though the ground beneath my feet had shifted. Brandon hadn't merely talked about my health. He had begun acting on those conversations, without asking, without telling me, without even considering how humiliating it would be to have a stranger arrive at my door, believing I might no longer know who I was. I went inside and immediately called Dr. Laura Mitchell. Her receptionist connected me within minutes. Caroline, Dr. Mitchell said warmly. How are you? I need to ask you something. Of course. I explained what had just happened. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, her voice became noticeably firmer. I never ordered a home assessment. I thought so. No medical professional in my office recommended one. Can my son arrange that without me? He can request information, but no one has the authority to diagnose you or evaluate your competence without proper consent unless there are extraordinary legal circumstances. I exhaled slowly. So this wasn't coming from you? Absolutely not. Then she added something that gave me both comfort and concern. Carolyn, I've been your physician for almost 15 years. If I believed you were experiencing cognitive decline, I would tell you honestly. I have no such concerns. Thank you. But, she paused. If anyone continues trying to pressure you into evaluations, you haven't requested document everything. I will. After hanging up, I carried a storage box down from the hall closet. It contained every legal document Michael and I had accumulated over the years. Insurance policies, property deeds, retirement paperwork, our wills, trust documents, power of attorney forms. Michael believed paperwork should always be organized. If someone ever has to help us, he'd say, they shouldn't have to search. As I sorted through the folders, I found a blue envelope labeled Estate Planning Update. The date caught my attention. It had been signed just 6 months after Michael died. I barely remembered that meeting. Grief had blurred so much of that year. Inside was a durable power of attorney. My eyes moved slowly across the pages. Primary agent? No, that was still me. Successor agent? I stopped breathing for a second. Brandon Hughes. I closed the folder and read it again from the beginning. Years earlier, Susan Whitmore had explained that someone should be listed in case I ever became unable to manage my own affairs. At the time, choosing Brandon had seemed obvious. He was my son. Who else would I choose? The document itself wasn't dangerous while I remained mentally competent. But another thought immediately entered my mind. What if someone succeeded in convincing people I wasn't? I picked up my phone. Susan? Caroline, my attorney answered. It's good to hear from you. I need to see you today. An hour later, I sat across from Susan in her downtown office. She carefully read every page before placing the folder on her desk. You remembered this today. I had completely forgotten. She nodded gently. That isn't unusual. You signed these shortly after Michael passed away. I wasn't thinking clearly. No. You were grieving. I looked directly at her. Tell me the truth. If Brandon convinces enough people that I'm mentally incapable, what happens? Susan folded her hands. While you're fully competent, this document changes nothing. You remain in complete control. But if a court determined you lacked capacity, he could begin acting as your financial agent. The room suddenly felt smaller. He could access my accounts within the limits of the document. He could manage your finances, pay bills, handle property matters, and potentially make decisions you might not agree with. I swallowed hard. So, everything depends on proving I'm incapable. Exactly. Susan leaned forward. Has Brandon given you any reason to believe he's pursuing that? I told her everything. The conversations, the birthday dinner, the comments about my memory, Nancy's visit, the phone call to Dr. Mitchell's office. Susan listened without interrupting. When I finished, she remained silent for several moments. Finally, she spoke. I don't like this. Neither do I. I think you need to revoke this document immediately. Can we? Today. She opened another file. We'll prepare a new durable power of attorney. You'll choose someone you trust. We'll also update your healthcare directives. And we'll notify the appropriate institutions that Brandon no longer has any future authority. I nodded without hesitation. For years, Susan said quietly, I've watched adult children pressure aging parents. Most cases begin with small things. Helping pay bills, offering advice, requesting access in case of emergencies. She looked directly into my eyes. But this feels different. Why? Because someone appears to be building a narrative. A narrative, one in which you're gradually seen as unable to make decisions. The words echoed exactly what I had been afraid to admit. Susan wasn't guessing. She had seen this before. She handed me a legal pad. From today forward, I want you to document everything. Every phone call. Every visit. Every text. Every unusual conversation. No detail is too small. I agreed. Before leaving, I signed the paperwork revoking Brandon's future authority. The ink had barely dried when Susan looked up from her computer. There is one more thing. What is it? I'd like you to contact Richard Bennett this afternoon. Ask him to review every recent inquiry involving your accounts. If someone is preparing to challenge your independence, they may already have started testing your financial defenses. I drove directly from Susan's office to Richard's. He welcomed me inside immediately. I've actually been meaning to call you, he said. My heart skipped. Why? Richard turned his monitor toward me. I've found another unusual activity report. He pointed to a line on the screen. About 3 weeks earlier, someone had initiated a credit inquiry using my personal information. It wasn't a completed loan. It wasn't an approved application. But it had been started, under my name. I never applied for any loan. I know. Richard's face grew serious. The inquiry involved financing for a commercial construction project. Commercial construction. Brandon's business. A cold sensation spread through my chest. This wasn't about one conversation anymore, or one folder, or one family argument. Someone had already begun using pieces of my identity. And for the first time since Michael died, I realized I wasn't just protecting my inheritance. I was protecting myself. For 3 days, I stared at Emily's old high school graduation photo sitting on my bookshelf. She was 18 in that picture, wearing a navy blue cap and gown, smiling with the kind of confidence only young people possess. Michael stood beside her with one arm around her shoulders, looking prouder than I had ever seen him. I picked up the frame and ran my thumb across the glass. "Where are you, sweetheart?" I whispered. Nothing about Emily's silence made sense. She had never gone more than a week without checking on me. Even when she moved to Chicago after college, she still called almost every Sunday evening. She remembered birthdays. She remembered anniversaries. She even remembered the date Michael died. Every year, she would simply say, "I'm thinking about Grandpa today." She never forgot. Yet now, she had disappeared. Or at least, that's what Brandon wanted me to believe. On Monday afternoon, my phone rang from an unfamiliar number. Normally, I ignored unknown callers. This time, something told me to answer. "Hello?" For 2 seconds, I heard nothing. Then a voice I hadn't heard in months whispered, "Grandma." My heart nearly stopped. "Emily." "I'm so sorry." The words came out between shaky breaths. "I've been trying to figure out how to call you." Tears immediately filled my eyes. "Where have you been?" I thought you didn't want to speak to me anymore." I couldn't even process what she'd said. "What? Dad told me you were angry. He said you blamed me for refusing to help the family." I sat down so suddenly that my kitchen chair scraped loudly across the floor. "What are you talking about?" Emily's breathing became uneven. "He said you told him you were disappointed in me. He said you didn't approve of the choices I'd made. He said you wanted some distance." I covered my mouth. "Oh, sweetheart. I never said any of that." Silence. Then I heard her crying. I knew it. I knew something wasn't right. I kept writing messages. "But Dad told me you didn't answer because you were upset." "I wrote letters." "What letters?" "He said he dropped them off." My hands began shaking again. I never received a single one. Neither of us spoke for several moments. We didn't need to. The truth was slowly revealing itself without either of us saying it aloud. Someone had been lying, and it wasn't Emily. "Can we meet?" she finally asked. "I'll meet you anywhere." The next morning, we chose a small, independent coffee shop 20 minutes from my neighborhood. It wasn't a place Brandon or Vanessa would normally visit. When I walked inside, I recognized Emily immediately. She looked older than 25, not because of wrinkles, because of exhaustion. She stood the moment she saw me. Neither of us said a word. We simply hugged. The kind of hug that begins politely but quickly becomes impossible to let go of. "I missed you," she whispered. "I missed you too." When we finally sat down, we spent several minutes simply looking at each other. "I thought you hated me," she admitted. "I thought you abandoned me." Emily wiped away another tear. I should have come anyway. No. You trusted your father. That isn't your fault. She looked down at her coffee. I don't know anymore. I reached across the table and took her hand. Tell me everything. She nodded slowly. You know I worked for Dad's company after college. I did. Brandon had proudly hired Emily as a project coordinator. At the time, he'd called it a family business. It started out well, she said. I loved the work. But things changed. How? She stared out the window before answering. The company got bigger. Bigger projects. Bigger loans. Bigger promises. And bigger risks. She explained that Brandon had become obsessed with expanding. Every successful project immediately led to another. Every profit was reinvested. Instead of building slowly, he borrowed heavily. Luxury developments, exclusive neighborhoods, massive renovation contracts. He kept saying we had to think bigger. Emily forced a sad smile. Grandpa would have hated hearing that. I couldn't disagree. What happened? A project called Hawthorne Ridge. She sighed deeply. It was supposed to be Dad's biggest success. A luxury residential development outside Columbus. Custom homes, private walking trails, high-end finishes. The investors expected enormous profits. Instead, construction costs exploded. Several subcontractors demanded payment earlier than expected. Interest rates increased. Buyers canceled contracts. Suppliers refused additional deliveries until previous invoices were paid. It became a nightmare. Brandon never mentioned any of this. He kept telling everyone the company was fine. Emily nodded. Because if investors found out how bad things really were, they'd leave. She stirred her coffee absent-mindedly. That's when things got worse. Worse. Dad started asking employees to move money between accounts. My stomach tightened. I didn't understand everything. But some invoices were delayed intentionally. Payments were shuffled. Loans were refinanced. And then, she stopped speaking. What? He asked me to sign documents. What kind? Financial reports. I told him I hadn't reviewed them. He said it didn't matter. I looked directly at her. What did you do? I refused. I felt an overwhelming wave of pride. I'm glad. He wasn't. Emily smiled sadly. He said I didn't understand business. He said I was choosing principles over family. The sentence sounded painfully familiar. Family. It was always about family. As long as family meant doing exactly what Brandon wanted. When I still refused, Emily continued. He stopped trusting me. She was gradually removed from important meetings, then from financial records, then from major projects. Finally, Brandon suggested she should find opportunities elsewhere. So I left. Did your parents help you afterward? She laughed bitterly. No. I found my own apartment. I found another job. We barely spoke. I sat there quietly absorbing every word. The son I had raised, the grandson Michael adored, the father Emily still desperately wanted to love. How had everything become so broken? There was one more thing. Emily's expression changed. Something darker. He asked me to talk to you. I know. He wanted me to convince you to transfer the cabin. I told him absolutely not. What did he say? He got angry. Emily lowered her voice. He said the cabin wasn't really yours anymore. I felt a chill run through me. What does that mean? He said it would belong to him soon anyway. Exactly the same words. Exactly. I thought he was just frustrated. Emily looked around to make sure no one nearby was listening. But then I overheard something. What? He was meeting with one of the investors. And he told the investor not to worry. He said additional collateral would be available. I frowned. What collateral? Emily swallowed. The cabin. I stared at her. He doesn't own the cabin. I know. He said the paperwork would be handled. My heartbeat became painfully loud. He promised someone property that wasn't his. Emily nodded slowly. I couldn't believe it. I confronted him afterward. What did he say? He told me not to interfere. He said I didn't understand how business negotiations worked. But Grandma, she looked directly into my eyes. I don't think he was negotiating. I think he was desperate. The coffee shop suddenly felt cold. Brandon hadn't simply hoped I would sign. He had already built plans around the assumption that I would. Investors, loans, promises. Everything depended on property that legally belonged to me. And somehow, he had convinced himself that my refusal wasn't even a possibility. As we stood outside preparing to leave, Emily hugged me again. I'm sorry I wasn't here. You are now. She smiled weakly. I don't know what Dad is going to do next. Neither did I. But for the first time in weeks, I no longer felt completely alone. I had lost my son's trust. But perhaps, without realizing it, I had found someone else who still believed the truth mattered. And deep inside, another realization quietly settled into my heart. If Brandon was willing to promise my cabin to strangers before it was ever his, then there was almost nothing he wouldn't do to make that promise come true. I didn't tell Emily what I was thinking as we stood outside the coffee shop. She was already carrying enough pain. She didn't need to know that every word she had spoken confirmed the fear growing quietly inside me. Brandon wasn't making desperate decisions anymore. He was building an entire future around assets that did not belong to him. And people who build their future on someone else's property rarely stop voluntarily. Before Emily left, she hugged me one last time. I'm scared for you, Grandma. I brushed a strand of hair away from her face, just as I had done when she was a little girl. I've been scared before. When Grandpa died. Yes. And I survived that. She gave me a sad smile. I wish I'd called sooner. So do I. But we're here now. She nodded. I love you. I love you too, sweetheart. As I watched her drive away, I thought about something Michael used to say. The hardest decisions aren't the ones that hurt strangers. They're the ones that hurt the people you still love. That afternoon, I called Susan Whitmore. I need to see you. Tomorrow morning. No. It can't wait. Her office squeezed me in before closing. She greeted me with a warm smile that disappeared the moment she saw my face. What happened? I told her everything. Emily. The lies. The fake messages. The business. The investors. The cabin. When I finished, Susan leaned back in her chair without speaking. Finally, she said quietly, I was afraid this might be where the story was heading. You expected this. I've handled estate cases for almost 30 years. She folded her hands. When money becomes more important than relationships, people often begin rewriting reality. They convince themselves they deserve what belongs to someone else. She opened my estate file. I think it's time. I knew exactly what she meant. I agree. Susan pulled several folders from a locked cabinet. The top page displayed the title, Revocable Living Trust. This is your current plan. I looked at the document. It hadn't changed since shortly after Michael passed away. Everything was exactly as we had arranged it together. Brandon Hughes, primary beneficiary. successor trustee, executor. Every important responsibility rested in his hands. At the time, it had made perfect sense. He was our only child. Michael and I never imagined anyone else would one day carry those responsibilities. Susan placed another blank document beside it. We have options. I don't want revenge. I know. I don't even want to disinherit Brandon. I didn't think you would. She smiled gently. That's why I wanted to wait until you were completely certain. I stared out her office window for several moments. Cars moved slowly through downtown Columbus. People hurried home after work. Life continued, completely unaware that one mother was about to change the future of her family forever. I still love my son. Susan nodded. I believe that. I probably always will. I know. But love isn't the same as trust anymore. Those words hurt more than I expected, because they were true. I could forgive mistakes. I could forgive failure. I could even forgive anger. What I couldn't ignore was deception, or manipulation, or the quiet effort to convince the world that I was no longer capable of making my own decisions. I don't want Brandon controlling my estate. Susan reached for her pen. What would you like instead? I took a deep breath. I want Emily. Susan looked up. As beneficiary. I slowly shook my head. No, not exactly. She waited. I want Emily to become the successor trustee. Susan smiled almost imperceptibly. I was hoping you'd say that. I looked at her surprised. Why? Because you're making this decision for the right reason. Explain. If you wanted revenge, you'd remove Brandon completely. If you wanted punishment, you'd leave everything to charity. But you're doing neither. She tapped the trust document. You're separating ownership from control. That was exactly it. I wasn't trying to erase my son. I was trying to protect what Michael and I had spent our lives building. Susan began outlining the revisions. The cabin will transfer directly to Emily. I nodded. That's what Rebecca wanted. And the remainder of your estate, I thought carefully. I don't want Brandon cut out. Susan looked slightly surprised. You don't? No. He's still my son. He'll remain a beneficiary. But, I paused. There need to be conditions. Susan waited quietly. If Brandon causes financial damage through fraud, identity theft, coercion, or unauthorized use of my property, I want every dollar deducted from his inheritance, she wrote quickly. If he owes restitution, it comes first. If legal judgments exist, they're satisfied first. If he attempts to challenge the trust without legitimate cause, his share is frozen until the dispute ends. Susan continued writing. What about distributions? I don't want him receiving everything at once. She nodded. Structured trust. Yes. Small annual distributions. Only after debts related to my estate are resolved. I looked down at my wedding ring. Michael had worn the matching band until the day he died. He always believed money should help people, not destroy them. Susan's voice softened. This plan reflects that. We worked for nearly 2 hours. Every paragraph mattered. Every sentence carried weight. The successor trustee changed from Brandon Hughes to Emily Hughes. One name, just one. Yet that single change altered the entire future of my estate. If I passed away tomorrow, Emily, not Brandon, would oversee every decision. She would ensure the trust followed my instructions. She would protect the cabin. She would account for every dollar. She would have the legal authority Brandon had always assumed would automatically become his. When the final page was ready, Susan slid it across the desk. You should read everything. I did. Twice. Then I signed. The witnesses entered one by one. Neither knew me personally. Neither knew Brandon. They simply verified my identity, watched me sign voluntarily, and added their own signatures. Susan placed a notary seal on the final page. The sound of that stamp striking the paper echoed through the quiet office. It felt strangely final. When everything was complete, Susan closed the folder carefully. Only 4 people know these changes. You, me, and the 2 witnesses. What about Emily? I haven't told her. Susan raised an eyebrow. Are you sure? Yes? If Brandon somehow discovers she's involved, I don't want her becoming his next target. Susan slowly nodded. I think that's wise. She locked the original documents inside a fireproof cabinet. I'll also register the updated trust and prepare certified copies. As I gathered my purse, Susan stopped me. Caroline, yes, your silence is going to confuse Brandon. I know. He'll think you're considering his proposal. I want him to. You do. I smiled for the first time in weeks. For months, he's believed I'm too weak to understand what he's doing. I'd rather he keeps believing that. Susan looked at me thoughtfully. I've known you for nearly 25 years. You've always been kind. You've always been patient. But today, she smiled, I met a different Caroline Hughes. I laughed quietly. No. You met the woman Michael always believed I could become. Driving home that evening, I didn't feel victorious. I felt sad. No mother dreams of rewriting her estate because she no longer trusts her own child. No mother imagines that protecting her legacy will require protecting it from her own family. Yet beneath the sadness was something I hadn't felt in months. Peace. For the first time since Brandon placed that folder on my dining table, I no longer felt defenseless. He believed he already knew how my story would end. He had no idea that with one quiet signature, I had already changed the ending. For the next 2 weeks, Brandon disappeared. No phone calls, no surprise visits, no text messages asking how I was feeling. The silence should have made me feel relieved. Instead, it made me uneasy. People like Brandon didn't simply give up. Not after investing so much time preparing legal documents, contacting financial offices, and trying to convince relatives that I was no longer capable of making my own decisions. He was planning something. I simply didn't know what. Then, on a bright Friday morning, my doorbell rang. When I opened the door, Brandon stood there holding a bouquet of white lilies, my favorite flowers. For just a fraction of a second, I saw the little boy who used to surprise me with dandelions picked from the school playground. Then I noticed the expensive watch on his wrist, the forced smile, the careful way he held the flowers. It wasn't affection. It was presentation. Hi, Mom. His voice sounded unusually gentle. I thought I'd stop by. I hesitated before stepping aside. Come in. He walked through the house slowly, almost studying everything around him. I haven't been here in a while. No, I've been busy. So you've said. He placed the flowers in my hands. I know things got awkward. I looked at him. Awkward. He sighed. I handled everything badly. I'm sorry. The apology came so quickly that it almost sounded rehearsed. I waited. I shouldn't have pushed you. I let stress get the better of me. He lowered his eyes, appearing almost ashamed. Our biggest investor finally came through. We're going to be okay. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I carried the flowers into the kitchen and placed them in a vase. They were beautiful. Too beautiful. People often bring flowers to apologize. but these felt more like props. When I returned, Brandon was examining the photographs on the fireplace. One showed Michael holding a fishing rod beside the cabin. Another showed Emily at 12 years old laughing after catching her first fish. Dad loved that place. He did. Brandon nodded slowly. I miss him. So do I. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he smiled. You know, I've been thinking. I don't want money to come between us. Neither did I, but I said nothing. I was wrong to pressure you. I should have trusted you. Again, silence. He looked almost disappointed that I wasn't responding emotionally. Mom. Yes. Aren't you going to say anything? I appreciate your apology. His smile returned. That's all. What else should I say? He laughed softly. I guess I deserve that. For another hour, he stayed at the house. He tightened the loose railing on the back porch. He replaced a burned-out light bulb in the garage. He even offered to clean the gutters. Watching him move around the house felt strangely familiar. This was the Brandon I had known after Michael died. Helpful, reliable, attentive. Part of me desperately wanted to believe he had changed. Another part remembered Susan's warning. A changing strategy is not the same as a changing heart. That evening, after Brandon left, I opened a small notebook Susan had given me. Across the first page I wrote, Friday, 10:15 a.m. Brandon visited unexpectedly. Brought lilies, apologized, claimed business problems were nearly solved, repaired porch railing, mentioned missing dad. No discussion of legal documents. It felt strange documenting my own son. Almost cruel. But Susan had insisted. Facts matter more than memories, she had said, especially when memories are challenged. 3 days later, Brandon called again. Mom. Yes. I was thinking maybe you could come over Sunday. For dinner. Vanessa's making your favorite roast. I almost laughed. Vanessa had never made roast beef for me in 15 years, not once. That sounds nice. You'll come? I will. His relief was almost audible. Great. We'll eat around 5. When I arrived Sunday evening, everything looked perfect. The dining room table had been set with the expensive china Vanessa usually reserved for Christmas. Candles burned softly. Soft jazz played in the background. Vanessa greeted me with an enthusiastic hug. It's so good to see you. Her warmth felt almost theatrical. Throughout dinner, they were impossibly pleasant. Brandon talked about childhood memories. Vanessa asked about my garden. Neither mentioned money. Neither mentioned the cabin. Neither mentioned inheritance. If I hadn't known everything I knew, I might have believed the nightmare was over. After dessert, Brandon leaned back in his chair. I'm really glad we did this. So am I. He smiled. I've been thinking about the future. There it was. I waited quietly. I realized I approached things the wrong way. I'm listening. I don't want anything from you. No. I only want to protect you. Vanessa immediately nodded. Exactly. She disappeared into the kitchen before returning with a slim cream-colored folder. Not another folder. I felt my heartbeat slow instead of quicken. I had expected this. She placed it carefully on the table. What's this? Oh, Vanessa smiled. Just something our accountant suggested. Brandon opened the folder. It's nothing like last time. I promise. He slid several papers toward me. At the top, I read, Property Protection Transfer. Protection, not inheritance, not ownership. Protection, different words, same destination. Brandon spoke calmly. You know, property taxes keep increasing. Yes. If something ever happened to you unexpectedly, I've updated my estate planning. His smile faltered for less than a second. I'm sure you have. This is different. How? If the cabin is transferred now, there will be tax advantages and easier maintenance. I continued reading. The legal language looked simpler than the previous agreement, almost friendly, until I reached page 4. Buried near the bottom was a clause granting Brandon immediate authority to refinance the property. Another paragraph authorized him to make structural changes without my written approval. There it was again. Control. Always control. I closed the folder gently. I won't be signing this. The room became very quiet. Vanessa spoke first. Caroline. It's only a precaution. I understand. But no. Brandon forced another smile. You don't have to decide tonight. I already have. He leaned forward. Mom. I'm trying to help. I know you believe that. I'm trying to protect what's ours. I looked directly into his eyes. It isn't ours. It's mine. His jaw tightened. For just a moment, the polite mask slipped. Then it returned. At that exact moment, someone walked into the dining room carrying a small black case. A middle-aged man in a gray suit. Mom, Brandon said quickly. This is Thomas Reed, my business partner. Thomas smiled professionally. Pleasure to meet you. He opened the black case. Inside was a notary seal. My pulse quickened. I thought you said this wasn't urgent. It isn't, Brandon replied too quickly. We just figured, since Thomas was already here, if you happen to agree. Thomas interrupted politely. Only if you're comfortable, Mrs. Hughes. I looked from Thomas to Brandon to Vanessa, then back to the papers. Everything suddenly became perfectly clear. The flowers, the apology, the family dinner, the expensive china, the candles. Every detail had been carefully arranged, not to rebuild our relationship, to obtain one signature. I slowly pushed the folder back across the table. I won't sign tonight. I won't sign tomorrow. And I won't sign this document ever. Brandon's smile disappeared completely. Thomas quietly closed the notary case. No one spoke for several seconds. Then I stood, picked up my purse, and walked toward the front door. As I reached for my coat, I heard Brandon whisper behind me. You don't understand what you're doing. I paused without turning around. No, Brandon. I answered calmly. I understand exactly what I'm doing. What I didn't tell him was that every word he spoke, every paper he prepared, and every trap he carefully arranged, only convinced me that changing one name had been the smartest decision I had made in years. I expected Brandon to call the next morning. He didn't. I expected an angry text. There wasn't one. By Tuesday, I realized something was different. He wasn't trying to persuade me anymore. I was preparing for something else. Susan used to tell me that when negotiations suddenly become quiet, it often means the real battle is about to begin. She was right. On Wednesday afternoon, I found a large certified envelope inside my mailbox. The return address belonged to the Franklin County Probate Court. For a moment, I simply stared at it. My hands felt strangely cold. People don't receive certified mail from a probate court because life is going well. I carried the envelope into the kitchen, sat at the same table where Brandon had first demanded my inheritance, and carefully opened it. The first page began with words I never imagined I would see beside my own name. Petition for emergency guardianship. I read the title again, then a third time. It still didn't make sense. According to the petition, Brandon Hughes was requesting that the court appoint him as my temporary guardian because I was allegedly no longer capable of managing my financial affairs or making safe, personal decisions. I kept reading. Every paragraph hurt more than the one before it. It claimed I had become forgetful, that I repeated conversations, that I had become suspicious of family members without reason, that I was vulnerable to outside influence, that I was isolating myself, that I was making irrational financial choices. The final sentence nearly took my breath away. Immediate intervention is necessary to protect Mrs. Caroline Hughes from financial exploitation and potential self-neglect. Financial exploitation. By whom? The only person trying to exploit my finances was the man who had signed that petition. I turned to the attached witness statements. The first belonged to Vanessa. She claimed she had observed me forgetting appointments, misplacing important documents, and becoming confused during ordinary conversations. Confused, I remembered every conversation we'd had, especially the ones she probably wished I had forgotten. The second statement came from Thomas Reed. He claimed he had witnessed me becoming emotionally unstable during a discussion about estate planning. I almost laughed. Thomas had met me exactly once, at Brandon's carefully staged dinner. Yet somehow he considered himself qualified to judge my mental capacity. There were copies of selected text messages attached as evidence. I immediately recognized them. They were real messages, but only fragments. One message showed me writing, "I don't remember discussing that." The page ended there. What it didn't include was the very next message I had sent 30 seconds later. "I don't remember discussing that because you never told me." Another message showed me writing, "I'm confused." Again, the rest had been removed. The complete sentence had actually been, "I'm confused about why you're suddenly asking for control of my property." Piece by piece, sentence by sentence. The truth had been cut apart until it looked like evidence against me. I sat motionless for several minutes. I wasn't angry, not yet. I was devastated. There is something uniquely painful about watching your own child rewrite your life in legal language. He wasn't arguing with me anymore. He was arguing with reality itself. My phone rang. "Susan, I assume you've received the petition." "Yes." "Are you all right?" "I don't know. I need you to come to my office." "I'm leaving now." 40 minutes later, I was sitting across from Susan again. She had already highlighted several sections of Brandon's filing. "He filed this Monday morning, so he'd already decided before Sunday dinner." Susan nodded. "I'm afraid so." "The dinner wasn't an attempt to repair your relationship. It was probably designed to strengthen his appearance as a caring son." The realization hurt. Even the apology, even the flowers, had likely been part of a strategy. Susan slid another document toward me. "This is the good news. There is good news. A guardianship isn't granted because someone claims you're forgetful. The court requires evidence." She began making a list. "Medical evaluations, financial records, independent testimony, professional assessments. We'll provide all of them." I took a slow breath. "What do I need to do?" "First," she smiled reassuringly, "you stay exactly as you've always been. No emotional outbursts. No angry messages. No dramatic confrontations. Let the evidence speak." I nodded. "We'll schedule an independent cognitive examination." "I don't need one." "I know. But the judge needs proof." The following morning, Susan accompanied me to see Dr. Laura Mitchell. She greeted us warmly. "I wish we were meeting under better circumstances." "So do I." Dr. Mitchell spent nearly 2 hours with me. Memory exercises, problem-solving questions, attention tests, short-term recall, long-term recall. She asked me the date, the current president, the names of my medications. She asked me to draw a clock showing a specific time, to remember 5 unrelated words, to perform simple calculations. She even asked me about events from childhood. At the end, she smiled. "I think we're finished." "How did I do?" She laughed softly. "You corrected one of my questions." "I did. You reminded me I had written today's date incorrectly." Susan laughed. "I noticed that too." Dr. Mitchell closed the evaluation folder. "I have absolutely no concerns regarding your cognitive ability." "None?" "None." She looked directly at me. "Caroline, you're grieving what your family has become." "That isn't dementia. It's heartbreak." Those words nearly made me cry. Before we left, she promised to prepare a detailed report for the court. Next came Richard Bennett. He printed nearly 3 years of financial statements, every bill paid on time, every investment reviewed, every tax payment submitted before the deadline. He even highlighted something I hadn't noticed. "You've actually increased your investment returns over the last 18 months. "I have," he smiled. "You've been making thoughtful decisions." Nothing in these records suggests financial impairment. Susan placed the reports neatly into a growing case file. "Medical evidence? Financial evidence. Now we need to address the accusations directly." 2 days later, I finally asked the question that had been haunting me. "What if the judge believes Brandon?" Susan didn't answer immediately. Instead, she handed me a copy of the petition again. "Read page 7. I did. Near the bottom was a sentence referencing my previous estate plan. Specifically, it described the original trust naming Brandon as successor trustee. I slowly looked up. "He shouldn't know this." Susan smiled. "Exactly. I never gave him that document." "I know." "Neither did I." "Then how?" The answer appeared before I finished speaking. Brandon had somehow obtained private estate documents. Documents he was never supposed to possess. And in his eagerness to convince the court I was incompetent, he had unknowingly revealed that he had accessed confidential legal information. Susan tapped the paragraph with her pen. "This may become one of the most important pieces of evidence." I stared at the page. For the first time since receiving the petition, I felt something other than fear. Brandon believed he had built a perfect legal case, but perfection often hides its own mistakes, and somewhere inside the papers he had filed against me, he had already left behind the crack that could bring his entire story crashing down. He just didn't know it yet. The guardianship hearing was still several weeks away. Susan wanted me to continue living exactly as I always had. "No sudden changes," she reminded me. "The strongest evidence is a normal life." So I kept my routine. Every morning I watered the flowers. Every Tuesday I bought groceries. Every Thursday I volunteered for 2 hours at the neighborhood literacy center, helping adults who were learning to read. Life looked ordinary. Inside, however, I carried a constant weight. At night, I often found myself walking through the house with all the lights off. Not because I enjoyed the darkness, because I knew every room by heart. The hallway where Brandon had raced toy trucks when he was 5. The dining room where Michael had surprised me with a homemade anniversary dinner after accidentally burning the first attempt. The living room where Emily had fallen asleep every Christmas Eve while pretending she wanted to stay awake for Santa. Every corner held a memory, and every memory made one question louder. When had our family started falling apart? One rainy Saturday afternoon, I decided to organize the upstairs study. Michael had always called it the room nobody ever cleans. He wasn't wrong. Old tax records filled one cabinet. Photo albums lined another. His desk remained exactly as he'd left it 3 years earlier. I had dusted it many times, but I had never truly gone through its drawers. Perhaps I wasn't ready. Until now. I opened the top drawer. Pens, paper clips, old receipts, nothing unusual. The second drawer contained family photographs, several fishing licenses, and one of Michael's favorite pocket knives. The bottom drawer was locked. For a moment, I simply stared at it. I remembered Michael smiling one evening. "If you ever need what's in there, the spare key is taped underneath the desk." At the time, I'd laughed. "What are you hiding?" My terrible handwriting. I reached beneath the desk. Sure enough, the tiny brass key was still there. My hands trembled slightly as I unlocked the drawer. Inside was a single cedar box. No jewelry, no cash. Just a wooden box with my name written neatly across the lid. For Caroline. My throat tightened. I carefully lifted the lid. Inside lay several documents tied together with blue ribbon. On top rested a sealed envelope. Michael's handwriting covered the front. "If you're reading this, it means you needed answers I wasn't here to give." Tears blurred my vision before I even opened it. I took a deep breath and unfolded the letter. "My dearest Caroline, if this letter has found you, then something has happened that I hoped never would. First, I need you to remember something. None of what follows changes how much I love our son. But love doesn't excuse blindness. Over the last several years, I've noticed changes in Brandon that worry me. Not because he works hard. I've always admired that. Not because he wants success. There's nothing wrong with ambition. What frightens me is that he's begun measuring people by what they own instead of who they are. Money has become the answer to every problem. Status has become more important than peace. And when a person starts believing success excuses every decision, danger follows." I paused. The words sounded as though Michael had written them yesterday. I continued reading. "A year ago, Brandon asked me whether we could use the cabin as collateral for one of his business loans. When I refused, he became angry. Not loudly, quietly. He spent nearly an hour explaining why I was being too cautious. He insisted family property should help family business. When I still refused, he asked whether the deed was in both our names. That question stayed with me for weeks. Not because he asked, because of why he asked. I realized that if anything happened to me first, you might one day face the same pressure. So I made several changes. The cabin now belongs entirely to you. Not because I love Brandon less, but because I trust you to protect what Rebecca asked us to preserve. Please don't ever mistake rescuing someone from consequences for loving them. Sometimes the kindest thing a parent can do is refuse to make the next mistake easier." By the time I reached the end of the page, tears were falling freely. I wasn't crying because Michael had predicted the future. I was crying because he had quietly tried to protect me from it. There was another folded page beneath the letter. This one contained copies of legal correspondence between Michael and Susan Whitmore. Everything matched what Susan had already explained. The cabin had indeed been transferred solely into my name after Rebecca's death. Michael had insisted on the change, not for tax reasons, not for convenience, for protection. I leaned back in Michael's old chair and closed my eyes. 3 years. For 3 years, I had believed those legal changes were simply practical estate planning. Now I understood. They had been an act of love, a final shield. As I carefully returned the letter to its envelope, something else caught my attention. At the bottom of the cedar box lay a small notebook. Most of it contained ordinary financial reminders. Insurance renewals, investment notes, home maintenance schedules. Then, about halfway through, I found an entry dated 6 months before Michael died. "Brandon came by tonight, asked again about using family property for business financing. Conversation remained calm, but I noticed something unsettling. After dinner, he wandered into my office alone. When I returned, he quickly closed the file cabinet. He claimed he was looking for old insurance paperwork. Perhaps he was. Perhaps not. Need to move estate documents somewhere more secure. Better safe than sorry. I read the paragraph 3 times. My pulse quickened. After dinner, he wandered into the office, looking for paperwork. A memory suddenly surfaced. The afternoon after Michael's funeral. Our house had been full of relatives. Food covered every countertop. People moved quietly from room to room. At one point, I'd been looking for Brandon. Someone mentioned he was upstairs. When I found him, he was standing inside Michael's study. I remembered asking what he was doing. He had smiled casually. Just looking for Dad's insurance information. At the time, I'd thought nothing of it. Now, the memory felt completely different. Had he been searching for insurance papers, or estate documents, or this very letter? A chill ran down my spine. If Michael hadn't hidden the cedar box inside the locked drawer, would Brandon have found it years ago? Would he have destroyed it? Or simply learned that his father no longer trusted his judgment? I didn't know. And perhaps I never would. That evening, I drove directly to Susan's office. Without saying a word, I handed her Michael's letter. She read it slowly. Very slowly. When she finished, she carefully folded it again. I wish I could have met him. You would have liked him. I already do. She looked at me with genuine sadness. He understood something many parents never do. What's that? That protecting a child and protecting their behavior are two very different things. I nodded. He still loved Brandon. I know. But he refused to let love become permission. Susan placed the letter back inside its envelope. This doesn't just explain why the cabin belongs to you. It explains intent. Intent. Yes. If Brandon ever argues these changes were unfair, this letter proves Michael's decisions were thoughtful, voluntary, and made years before today's conflict. She paused. It may become one of the strongest documents we have. As I prepared to leave, I looked once more at Michael's handwriting. His final sentence lingered in my mind. Sometimes the kindest thing a parent can do is refuse to make the next mistake easier. For months, I had struggled with guilt. Every legal document I signed felt like a betrayal of my son. Now, for the first time, I understood something Michael had already known. I wasn't betraying Brandon. I was refusing to help him destroy himself. And there was a world of difference between those two things. By the following Monday, Susan had assembled what she called the complete picture. Medical evaluations, financial records, witness statements, copies of Brandon's legal filings, Michael's letter. Every document sat neatly arranged inside 3 thick binders. They tell one story, Susan said as she closed the last binder. What story? That you're a competent woman protecting herself. I wished the story ended there. It didn't. Richard Bennett called that afternoon. Caroline, he said, I need you to come in. His voice sounded different, not frightened, urgent. I'll be there in 30 minutes. When I arrived, he didn't offer coffee like he usually did. He simply motioned toward his office. I've been working with the bank's fraud department. I sat down slowly. Did they find something? He nodded. Yes. He turned his monitor toward me. On the screen was a digital loan application. The applicant's name was mine. Caroline Hughes. The address was mine. The date of birth was mine. The social security information matched mine. My driver's license number appeared correctly. Everything belonged to me. Except I had never seen the document before. I didn't fill this out. I know. Richard enlarged the signature block. An electronic signature appeared at the bottom. At first glance, it looked remarkably convincing. But after studying it for several seconds, I noticed something. The C in Caroline curved the wrong direction. The H in Hughes was too narrow. Someone had copied my signature. They hadn't actually written it. "I've never signed this. The fraud investigators agree." My stomach turned. "What was the loan for?" Richard clicked another page. "Commercial construction, financing borrower, purpose, working capital for Hawthorne Ridge development." The room suddenly felt very quiet. The same development Emily had warned me about. The same project Brandon insisted would soon recover. The same project that apparently needed financing under my name. "How far did this application go?" Richard sighed. "Farther than we first believed. It wasn't just a credit inquiry. They submitted supporting documentation." "What kind?" He handed me a folder. Copies of my driver's license, my property tax records, a digital image of my signature, even a copy of my homeowner's insurance declaration. I recognized every document. Some had been stored inside the filing cabinet in my home. Others had only existed electronically. How? I couldn't finish the question. Richard answered it anyway. "Whoever submitted this had extensive personal information. They also knew details about your financial history." I closed my eyes. There were fewer and fewer possible explanations. "This wasn't approved?" "No." "Why not?" "The underwriter requested a direct confirmation phone call. The applicant never completed it." "So no money was issued?" "No." He leaned forward. "But attempted fraud is still attempted fraud." The words echoed inside my head. Attempted fraud. Not a misunderstanding. Not poor judgment. Not desperation. Fraud. I stared silently at the paperwork. Richard spoke carefully. "I know this is your son." "Yes. And I know this conversation is painful." I nodded without looking up. "But if we ignore this," he could try again. "I know. And next time, he may succeed." For several moments, I couldn't speak. Every parent imagines difficult conversations. Teaching a child right from wrong, helping them through heartbreak, supporting them after failure. No parent imagines sitting inside a financial office discussing whether their child attempted identity fraud. "I need a moment." Richard quietly left the office. I remained alone. My reflection stared back at me from the dark computer screen. I looked tired, older. Not because I was 67, because grief ages people differently. Losing Michael had filled me with sadness. Watching Brandon become someone I barely recognized filled me with something far more complicated. Shame. Not shame for myself. Shame that somehow my son believed this was acceptable. 20 minutes later, I drove directly to Susan's office. She read every page without interrupting. When she finished, she closed the folder very gently. "This changes things." "How?" "Until now, we suspected financial exploitation. Now we have evidence of attempted identity fraud." I looked down. "I still don't want him arrested." Susan nodded slowly. "I expected you to say that." "He's my son." "I know. But protecting him and protecting yourself are no longer the same decision." She pushed the documents toward me. "The bank will likely ask whether you want to cooperate fully." "What happens if I do?" "The investigation continues." "And if I don't?" She held my gaze. "Nothing prevents another attempt." I rubbed my temples. Everything hurt. My heart, my head, even my hands. I whispered the question that had haunted me for weeks. "When did he stop seeing me as his mother?" Susan answered softly. "I don't think he stopped." I looked up. I think he convinced himself that his goals justified everything. That's different. Different, perhaps, but it didn't hurt any less. 2 evenings later, Brandon appeared at my front door. This time, he wasn't carrying flowers. He wasn't smiling. His expensive SUV sat running in the driveway. He walked inside without waiting to be invited. "We need to talk." His voice sounded tense. I closed the front door behind him. "What about? I heard you've been talking to lawyers." "I have." "And Richard Bennett." "Yes." His jaw tightened. "You didn't have to do that." "I didn't." "No. You could have just called me." I folded my arms. "Would you have told me about the loan application?" Silence. "I don't know what you're talking about." I walked into the living room and picked up the folder Susan had prepared. Without saying a word, I handed him the first page. His eyes scanned it. For the first time since all of this began, I watched confidence disappear from his face. "Where did you get this? The bank?" He swallowed. "Mom, I can explain. I'd like to hear it." He sat down heavily. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this." "What wasn't?" "The application. You submitted it." He hesitated, then slowly nodded. "I wasn't trying to steal from you. No, I was going to pay everything back." I stared at him. "You used my name." "I didn't have a choice." "There is always a choice." "The company would have collapsed." "So you chose me instead." His voice rose. "You don't understand. I had dozens of employees depending on me. Investors. Families. I just needed temporary financing. You forged my identity. I borrowed it." Borrowed. The word hit me harder than I expected. "You borrowed my identity. I knew you'd never lose anything. You couldn't know that. I would have fixed it. Before I found out." He looked away. Silence filled the room. Finally, he whispered. I was desperate. There it was. Not denial, not excuses. The truth. Or at least, part of it. "What else haven't you told me?" He didn't answer. Instead, his eyes drifted toward the coffee table, toward the decorative bowl, toward the family photographs. Everywhere, except my face. Only then did I notice something. His phone. Lying screen down beside him. The small red recording reflected faintly against the polished wood. He was recording our conversation. Without my permission. Without telling me. A chill ran through my entire body. Suddenly, I understood. He hadn't come to apologize. He hadn't come to confess. He had come hoping I would become emotional, angry, confused, anything he could later present as proof that I was unstable. I thought he was collecting evidence against me. He had no idea. He had just admitted to using my identity for a fraudulent loan. And every single word was now being recorded. The first instinct I had was to point at Brandon's phone and demand that he stop recording me. Instead, I did nothing. Not because I approved of what he was doing, because for the first time in months, I realized he believed he was in complete control. People who believe they have already won often stop being careful. I lowered myself slowly into the armchair across from him. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. The only sound in the room came from the old grandfather clock Michael had inherited from his father. Tick, tick, tick. Brandon looked uncomfortable. He had expected shouting, accusations, maybe tears. Instead, I folded my hands in my lap. "Would you like some coffee?" He blinked. "What?" I asked if you'd like some coffee. No, I guess not. All right, I nodded. So, you said you wanted to explain. He looked briefly toward his phone before answering. I already told you. I was desperate. I smiled sadly. Desperate people still make choices. He shifted in his seat. I've admitted I made mistakes. I appreciate that. The word appreciate seemed to relax him. He thought the conversation was moving in his favor. It wasn't. I leaned forward slightly. I just want to understand. Understand what? When did the financial problems actually begin? He hesitated. About a year ago. A year. I thought Sunday was the first time things became difficult. He rubbed the back of his neck. They'd been building. So Hawthorne Ridge wasn't just having temporary cash flow issues. His eyes widened for a fraction of a second. He hadn't expected me to know the project's name. Who told you about Hawthorne Ridge? I asked you a question. He looked away. It was behind schedule. How far behind? Several months. And the investors? They became impatient. How impatient? They wanted guarantees. I nodded slowly. So that's why you needed collateral? His shoulders slumped. Yes. What collateral had you promised them? Silence. I waited. Finally, he answered. The cabin. I kept my expression calm. You promised them my cabin. I said I expected to control it. You expected. I knew you'd eventually agree. How? Because you're my mother. I let those words settle between us. You believed that guaranteed my signature. He didn't answer. I continued gently. How much money was involved? He sighed deeply. Too much. I need a number. He stared at the floor. Almost $3 million. I felt my heartbeat quicken. 3 million. Far more than I had imagined. No bank would lend more. The investors wanted additional security, so you offered property that wasn't yours. I thought it would become mine. When? He looked frustrated. Eventually. I spoke quietly. Eventually isn't ownership, Brandon. He covered his face with both hands. You don't understand business. No. I understand honesty. He laughed bitterly. Honesty doesn't pay subcontractors. Dishonesty destroys families. He didn't argue. For several moments, the room became completely silent. I could almost hear him thinking, calculating, searching for another explanation. Finally, he looked at me again. The loan application. I'm sorry. You used my driver's license. Yes. My social security information. Yes. My signature. Yes. You knew it was illegal. I knew. He stopped, then corrected himself. I knew it wasn't right. Why did you do it anyway? His answer came almost immediately. Because I thought I'd fix everything before you ever found out. I nodded once. So, if the loan had been approved, you would have never told me. He couldn't look at me. No. I noticed the red recording light again. Still flashing. Still capturing every word. I wondered if Brandon had forgotten it was there, or if he believed these admissions somehow helped him. Either way, I wasn't about to interrupt. Instead, I asked another question. What would have happened if the project failed? His voice became almost a whisper. I would have lost everything. And me, silence. And me, Brandon. He finally answered. I didn't think you'd actually lose the house. You didn't think? No. You assumed. He closed his eyes. Yes. I leaned back in my chair. So, let's understand this correctly. You used my identity. Yes. You promised investors property you didn't own. Yes. You tried convincing relatives I couldn't manage my finances. He hesitated. Yes or no? Yay. You arranged a home assessment without asking me. Yes. You filed for guardianship. Yes. You secretly recorded this conversation. His eyes shot toward the phone. For the first time, he realized what he had forgotten. His face turned pale. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse him. I simply looked at the phone. Still recording. Neither of us moved. The tiny red light continued blinking. Brandon reached for it instinctively. Wait. He froze. Don't. He stared at me. You wanted this conversation recorded. You believed I'd become angry. I wasn't. You thought I'd shout. Mom. You thought I'd sound unstable. He slowly lowered his hand. I just wanted proof. Proof of what? That. He couldn't finish. That I wasn't thinking clearly. He looked completely defeated. I never imagined. No, you didn't. You imagined recording your elderly mother losing control. You never imagined recording yourself admitting everything instead. His shoulders collapsed, for the first time since this nightmare began. He looked frightened, not angry, not defensive, afraid. He picked up the phone with trembling hands. I'll delete it. No. He stared at me. What? You don't need to. His forehead creased. I don't understand. I know. He swallowed. I don't want anyone hearing this. I imagine you don't. Another long silence filled the room. Then, Brandon asked the question that surprised me most. Are you calling the police? I looked at my son, the little boy who once defended me over an old station wagon. The teenager who begged Michael to teach him how to fish. The young father who had cried when Emily was born. All of those memories still existed. So did the man sitting across from me now. I haven't decided. His eyes filled with tears. Real ones. Not rehearsed. Not performed. I've ruined everything, I answered honestly. No. You ruined trust. Those aren't always the same thing. He lowered his head. I'm sorry. I believe you're sorry. Hope flickered across his face. Then I continued. I just don't know whether you're sorry because you hurt me or because you finally got caught. The hope disappeared. He stood slowly. I should go. Yes. At the front door, he stopped without turning around. I never wanted to become this person. My voice remained calm. Neither did I. He walked outside without another word. I watched from the living room window as he sat inside his SUV for several minutes before driving away. Only after he disappeared around the corner did I allow myself to cry. Not because I had won, because every answer I needed had come from my own son's mouth. And somewhere inside the phone, he carried away with him. Every confession, every admission, every lie unraveling into truth still existed. Brandon believed deleting the recording would erase what had happened. He didn't know one very important thing. During legal discovery for the guardianship case, any recording he intended to use as evidence could be requested in its original complete form. And if his attorney still planned to rely on it, the truth Brandon had accidentally captured would soon belong to the courtroom instead of just to him. for the first time since this ordeal began. The weapon he had carefully prepared against me had quietly become the strongest evidence waiting to destroy his own case. The morning of the guardianship hearing arrived gray and unusually cold. I stood in front of the hallway mirror, fastening the small pearl earrings Michael had given me on our 25th wedding anniversary. I had worn them at Emily's college graduation, at Michael's retirement party, at his funeral. Today, I wore them because they reminded me of who I had always been. Not the confused, vulnerable woman Brandon described in court papers. Just Caroline Hughes, a widow, a retired librarian, a mother, a grandmother, a woman who knew exactly who she was. Susan arrived at my house at 8:30. She smiled warmly when I opened the door. "You look ready." "I don't feel ready." "No one ever does." She glanced toward the family photographs lining my hallway. "But you're prepared." That was true. Over the past several weeks, we had assembled every document imaginable. Medical evaluations, financial statements, the fraudulent loan application, Michael's letter, records from Richard Bennett, emails, text messages, phone logs. Everything had been organized with painstaking care. The truth was ready. Whether the court believed it, that was another matter. The Franklin County Probate Court was already busy when we arrived. Families sat quietly in the waiting area. Some looked anxious, others exhausted. A few avoided making eye contact altogether. No one comes to probate court expecting a pleasant morning. Across the hallway, I saw Brandon. He wore a navy blue suit Michael had helped him buy years ago for his first major business presentation. Seeing him wear it today felt strangely symbolic. Michael had purchased that suit believing it would accompany Brandon through a successful career. Instead, it had accompanied him into court against his own mother. Vanessa stood beside him in a cream-colored dress. Thomas Reed was flipping through a binder while speaking quietly with Brandon's attorney. Brandon looked up. For a brief moment, our eyes met. He started walking toward me. His attorney gently touched his arm. "Not now." He stopped immediately. The judge entered the courtroom a few minutes later. Everyone stood. Once we were seated, the proceedings began. Brandon's attorney rose first. He spoke calmly, respectfully, professionally. "Your Honor, this petition arises from concern, not conflict." He described Brandon as a devoted son trying to protect his aging mother. He spoke about my supposed isolation, my alleged memory problems, my resistance to family assistance. He even praised Brandon for sacrificing time and money to care for me after Michael died. Listening to him was surreal. Almost everything he said contained a tiny piece of truth, wrapped inside a much larger lie. Brandon had helped me after Michael died. Yes, he had visited regularly. Yes, he had cared, at least for a while. The problem wasn't what the attorney included. It was everything he left out. Then, Vanessa took the witness stand. She smiled sadly before answering questions. "I love Caroline. I've always thought of her as another mother." The words sounded polished, practiced. She described me forgetting conversations, repeating stories, growing suspicious of relatives. She claimed I had become frightened by ordinary financial paperwork. At one point, she even dabbed her eyes with a tissue. Watching her perform sadness was almost harder than listening to the accusations themselves. Finally, Susan stood. She didn't begin by attacking Vanessa. She simply walked to the evidence table and picked up Dr. Laura Mitchell's report. "Your Honor, I'd like to begin with objective medical evidence." For nearly 20 minutes, she carefully reviewed every cognitive assessment: perfect orientation, normal memory, excellent executive functioning, no evidence of dementia, no evidence of cognitive decline. Dr. Mitchell herself then testified. She explained every examination, every score, every observation. When Brandon's attorney asked whether highly intelligent patients could hide dementia, she answered calmly, "Not across multiple evaluations of this length." Mrs. Hughes is cognitively healthy. The courtroom grew noticeably quieter. Next came Richard Bennett. He carried several thick binders. One by one, he presented years of financial records. Every bill paid on time, investment performance, tax history, account management. Mrs. Hughes has consistently demonstrated careful financial judgment. Brandon's attorney attempted another angle. "Mr. Bennett, isn't it possible an older client could decline suddenly?" "Anything is possible," Richard replied evenly. "But possibilities aren't evidence." The judge nodded slightly. Then Susan requested permission to introduce additional exhibits. "This matter isn't simply about competence. It's about motive." She displayed the attempted loan application using my identity. The judge studied it carefully. Brandon shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Susan continued. "The petitioner claims he's protecting his mother from financial exploitation." She paused. "Yet evidence shows Mrs. Hughes became the target of attempted financial exploitation herself." Brandon's attorney immediately objected. "Relevance," Susan answered before the judge could speak. "The petition alleges my client cannot safely manage her finances. This evidence demonstrates someone else attempted to manage them for her." The objection was overruled. The judge examined every page, copies of my identification, the forged electronic signature, the commercial loan request, everything. For the first time that morning, Brandon avoided looking at me. Susan wasn't finished. She placed another document before the court. "The petitioner repeatedly states he acted solely out of concern." She lifted Brandon's guardianship petition. "However," she pointed toward a specific paragraph, "this filing references confidential provisions of Mrs. Hughes' previous trust." The judge adjusted his glasses. Susan continued. "These documents were never provided to Mr. Hughes. They were stored privately. We therefore ask how he obtained knowledge of their contents." Brandon's attorney hesitated, then answered carefully. "My client may have seen earlier drafts." Susan immediately replied. "Earlier drafts kept inside Mrs. Hughes' private estate file." Silence. The courtroom became almost perfectly still. Then came the moment I will never forget. Susan looked toward Brandon's attorney. "During discovery, your office produced a recording your client intended to rely upon." My heart began beating faster. The recording. The attorney looked uneasy. Susan continued. "We request the court hear the complete unedited file." Brandon suddenly looked toward his lawyer. For the first time all morning, panic appeared on his face. The judge approved the request. The courtroom speakers crackled softly. Then Brandon's own voice filled the room. "I used my mom's identity. I thought I'd fix everything before she found out." Another pause. "Then, I promised the cabin. It was supposed to become mine anyway." Several people in this courtroom looked toward Brandon. The recording continued. "I arranged the application. I was desperate." "You used my driver's license." "Yes." "My social security information." "Yes." "My signature." "Yes." Every admission, every answer, every confession, playing inside the silent courtroom. No one interrupted. No one needed to. When the recording ended, the silence felt almost overwhelming. The judge looked directly at Brandon. "Mr. Hughes, did you make these statements?" His attorney whispered something urgently. Brandon closed his eyes, then answered quietly, "Yes." The judge removed his glasses. "The petition for guardianship is denied." Relief flooded through me, but the judge wasn't finished. He continued speaking. The evidence presented establishes that Mrs. Hughes remains fully competent. Furthermore, he glanced toward the loan documents. The court has significant concerns regarding potential financial misconduct. He ordered copies of the evidence forwarded to the appropriate investigative authorities. Finally, he looked directly at Brandon. Until further notice, you are not to pressure, coerce, or interfere with your mother's financial decisions. Failure to comply may result in additional legal consequences. The gavel struck once. The hearing was over. People slowly began leaving the courtroom. Brandon remained seated, his shoulders slumped. Vanessa stood silently beside him. Neither looked at me. Susan gently touched my arm. You did it. I shook my head. No. The truth did. As we walked toward the exit, Susan asked quietly, Do you want to reveal the updated trust today? I looked back one final time. Brandon still believed he remained my successor trustee. He had lost the guardianship case, but he had no idea he had already lost something far greater months earlier. No, I answered softly. Not today. Why? Because today wasn't about punishment. It was about proving I still have the right to make my own decisions. Susan smiled. And the trust? That conversation. I glanced once more at my son before walking through the courthouse doors. Will come when he's finally forced to understand what trust actually means. The courthouse emptied, but the silence that followed the hearing stayed with me for weeks. People often imagine that winning in court feels like standing on a mountaintop. It doesn't. It feels like finally setting down a weight you've been carrying for so long that you've forgotten what it was like to breathe freely. The guardianship petition was over. The truth had prevailed. Yet when I returned home that afternoon, I still set 2 coffee cups on the kitchen counter before remembering Michael wasn't there. Victory didn't erase grief. It simply gave grief room to breathe again. Life slowly settled into a quieter rhythm. I returned to the literacy center every Thursday. Emily began visiting every other weekend. Sometimes we'd spend Saturday mornings planting flowers. Other times we'd drive to the cabin and sit on the old wooden dock with our feet dangling above the water. We didn't always talk. We didn't need to. Peace has a language of its own. Nearly 4 months passed before I heard Brandon's name again. It was Richard Bennett who called first. I thought you should know. What happened? Hawthorne Ridge officially entered foreclosure. I closed my eyes. I was afraid of that. The lenders have taken control of the remaining properties. And Brandon, he'll likely lose the company. I thanked Richard and hung up. 5 minutes later, Susan called. I've received notice of 3 separate civil lawsuits. Against Brandon? Yes. Several subcontractors and investors are seeking damages. And the criminal investigation? They're still reviewing the fraud evidence. I walked to the living room window. Autumn had arrived. The maple tree Michael planted years ago had turned brilliant shades of red and orange. Leaves drifted slowly across the front yard. Everything in nature seemed to understand that letting go was part of survival. People, unfortunately, rarely learn that lesson so easily. A week later, I learned something else. Vanessa had moved out. Emily told me quietly over dinner. They're separated. I looked up from my plate. Are you sure? She nodded. Mom rented an apartment downtown. What happened? Emily gave a tired shrug. They blamed each other. Dad said she pressured him into expanding. Mom said he lied about the finances. Neither surprised me. People united by ambition often become strangers when success disappears. Another month passed. Winter settled over Columbus. One snowy Tuesday morning, Susan called again. Brandon contacted me. My heart skipped. What did he want? He asked whether you'd agree to meet. I was silent. He says he wants to apologize. Susan didn't pressure me. She simply waited. What do you think? I think that's a decision only you can make. I looked outside at the snow covering the front yard. I'll meet him, but not here. Agreed. 3 days later, I walked into Susan's conference room. Brandon was already there. For a moment, I barely recognized him. He had lost weight. Dark circles surrounded his eyes. His expensive suits had been replaced by a simple charcoal jacket. The confidence that once filled every room had disappeared. He stood as I entered. Mom, I nodded politely. Brandon. Susan quietly closed the conference room door behind us. No one spoke for almost a minute. Finally, Brandon broke the silence. I'm sorry. His voice cracked. I know the words aren't enough. No, they aren't. He looked down at the table. I've replayed everything in my head. The hearing, the recording, the loan. I keep asking myself how I became that person. I listened without interrupting. My company is gone. I know. Vanessa left. I know. I lost almost every investor. I know. He looked at me with exhausted eyes. I've already paid for what I did. The sentence lingered between us. Had he had lost his company, his marriage, his reputation. But had he truly understood what he had tried to take from me? I'm not sure you have. He frowned. What do you mean? You lost money. You lost status. You lost a business. I leaned forward slightly. But those aren't the things that hurt me. He swallowed. You tried to convince the world I couldn't speak for myself. His shoulders dropped. I know. You tried to make me doubt my own reality. I know. You looked at my life and saw assets instead of memories. Tears filled his eyes. I know. I can't undo it. No. You can't. Another long silence followed. Finally, he whispered, I still thought. He hesitated. What? I thought maybe someday, when you were gone, I'd still. He couldn't finish. I understood anyway. You thought you'd still inherit everything. He nodded almost imperceptibly. Susan looked toward me. I gave her a small nod. She opened the locked folder she had placed on the table before we arrived. Mr. Hughes, she said calmly, there's something your mother believes you need to see. She removed a certified summary of my trust. Brandon looked confused. What is this, Your mother's current estate plan. His eyes moved across the first page, then the second, then suddenly stopped. He read one line again, and again. His face turned completely pale. What? His voice barely worked. What is this? Susan answered quietly. The current successor trustee. He looked at the page. Emily Hughes. No. He turned another page. The cabin, transferred directly to Emily. He flipped faster. The remaining estate, still listing him as a beneficiary. Then he reached the conditions. Fraud, restitution, structured distributions. No direct control, no immediate access. His hands began shaking. When? He looked at me. When did you do this? The week after you demanded my inheritance. You changed everything. I changed one name. He stared at me in disbelief. You made Emily responsible. Yes. She planned this with you. No. His head snapped upward. What? Emily didn't know. He blinked. She had no idea. I didn't tell her. Not until after the court hearing. He sat back slowly. So, she never asked for any of this? No. The room became completely silent. Finally, Brandon whispered, I blamed her. I know. I thought she turned you against me. No one needed to. He closed his eyes. I did that myself. Susan gently turned to another page. Mr. Hughes, your mother did not remove you entirely. He looked confused. I didn't. No. You remain a beneficiary. Hope briefly flickered across his face. Then Susan continued. However, your inheritance is protected. Protected. It will remain in trust. It cannot be controlled directly by you. It will not be distributed until restitution obligations are satisfied. You must complete financial counseling. You must resolve outstanding legal judgments related to your misconduct. You cannot use the inheritance as collateral. You cannot assign it. You cannot accelerate distributions. Brandon stared silently at the pages. Finally, he looked at me. You could have left me nothing. Yes. Why didn't you? I took a long breath before answering. Because you're still my son. Tears rolled down his face. I don't deserve this. No, you don't. He looked surprised by my honesty. But punishment wasn't my goal. What was? I held his gaze. Protection. For me. For Emily. And I paused. For the part of you I still hope can become a better man. Brandon covered his face with both hands. For several moments, the only sound in the room was his quiet crying. I didn't comfort him. Not because I didn't care. Because some pain must be experienced before healing can begin. And for the first time, I believed my son was finally beginning to understand the difference between losing money and losing trust. When Brandon finally lowered his hands, his eyes were red from crying. For the first time in many months, he wasn't trying to persuade me. He wasn't negotiating. I wasn't calculating. He simply looked like a tired little boy who had wandered too far from home and no longer knew the way back. I'm ashamed, he whispered. I believed him, not because of the tears, because there was nothing left for him to gain. The company was gone. The court case was over. The trust had already been changed. For the first time since all of this began, he wasn't speaking to influence my decision. He was living with the consequences of his own. You once asked me why I was saving my money, I said quietly. He nodded. I know. You said you were my only child. I did. You said everything would belong to you eventually. He lowered his eyes. I remember. I folded my hands on the conference table. You were wrong. His head lifted slightly. Not about the money. About the meaning. He frowned. I don't understand. An inheritance isn't a reward for being born into a family. It isn't payment for sharing someone's last name. It is the final expression of trust. The room became completely still. When your father and I built our savings, we weren't building a prize. We were building security. When we paid off our house, we weren't creating wealth. We were creating peace. When Rebecca entrusted me with that cabin, she wasn't giving me real estate. She was giving me responsibility. I looked directly into Brandon's eyes. You stopped seeing responsibility. You only saw value. A tear slid down his cheek. I know. You believed I was standing between you and your future. But I wasn't. I was standing between you and your worst decision. He covered his mouth as another wave of emotion hit him. I wish I could change everything. So do I. I'd give anything. I smiled sadly. Sometimes the most expensive lessons can't be paid for with money. He nodded slowly. I understand that now. I hope you do. Susan quietly excused herself from the room, giving us privacy. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. Finally, Brandon asked the question I had expected since the beginning. Will you ever trust me again? I answered honestly. I don't know. His shoulders fell. But I hope one day I can. I'll spend the rest of my life earning it. I hope you do. He stood slowly. I don't expect forgiveness. Good. He looked surprised. Forgiveness isn't something you request. It's something another person chooses when they're ready. He nodded. I'll wait. Before leaving, he walked toward me carefully. May I hug you? I hesitated, not because I hated him, because I needed to be certain my answer came from peace instead of guilt. After a long moment, I stood. We embraced. It wasn't the embrace of a family healed. It was the embrace of two people acknowledging that healing had finally become possible. When he stepped away, he whispered, I love you, Mom. I love you too. And that's exactly why I couldn't let you continue. He cried again, then quietly walked out of the room. A week later, I invited Emily to the cabin. The first snow of the year had melted, leaving the lake perfectly still beneath a pale blue sky. We sat on the old wooden porch, wrapped in blankets, each holding a mug of hot chocolate. There was something Grandpa wanted you to have. I handed her Michael's letter. She read it slowly. Halfway through, tears rolled silently down her face. I miss him. So do I. When she finished, I handed her another envelope. This one is from me. She opened it carefully. Inside was a certified copy of the trust summary. She stared at the page for several seconds before looking back at me. Grandma, I can't. You can. No. This should have been Dad. I gently shook my head. This isn't about choosing favorites. It's about choosing responsibility. She looked overwhelmed. You trust me that much? I do. But what if I make mistakes? You will. So did I. So did Grandpa. The difference is whether you learn from them. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. I promise I'll protect everything exactly the way you asked. I know you will. I won't use it against Dad. I know. I just want our family to heal. I smiled. So do I. 1 year later, life looked very different. Every Thursday, I still volunteered at the literacy center. Every Saturday, Emily came by with groceries, though I insisted on paying for my own. We spent weekends at the cabin planting wildflowers along Rebecca's favorite walking trail. The house no longer felt lonely. It felt peaceful. Brandon had accepted a management position with a small local construction company. The salary was modest. The hours were long. But for the first time in years, he wasn't chasing rapid success. He attended financial counseling every month. He continued making restitution payments connected to the attempted fraud. Occasionally, he called. Not to ask for money, not to discuss inheritance. Simply to ask, how are you today, Mom? Sometimes we had lunch together, always in public places, always for an hour or two. Trust wasn't fully restored. Perhaps it never would be. But respect slowly returned, and that was enough. One afternoon, while Emily and I sat watching the sunset over the lake, she asked, "Grandma, do you ever regret changing the trust?" I looked across the calm water. Orange light reflected gently across its surface. I thought about Michael, Rebecca, the courtroom, the lies, the tears, the silence. Then I smiled. No, I regret that I had to. But I don't regret protecting what your grandfather and I spent our lives building. Emily rested her head against my shoulder. I think Grandpa would be proud of you. A soft breeze moved across the lake. For just a moment, I could almost hear Michael laughing somewhere beyond the trees. Maybe memories really do outlive people. Maybe love does too. I learned something through all of this that no amount of money could ever teach. Family isn't defined by who expects your inheritance. Family is defined by who protects your dignity while you're still alive. That became the greatest legacy I could ever leave behind. Life. Lesson. If you've stayed with me until the end, I want to leave you with one thought. Growing older does not mean surrendering your voice. Too many parents believe that love requires endless sacrifice, even when that sacrifice destroys their own peace. But love without boundaries can become permission for others to take more than they should. An inheritance is never just money. It represents years of hard work, sleepless nights, careful decisions, and dreams shared between people who built a life together. No one is entitled to that simply because they are family. Helping someone you love is a beautiful thing. Protecting them from every consequence of their choices is not. Sometimes the kindest decision is the hardest one. The decision to let someone face the results of their own actions so they have the chance to become a better person. I never stopped loving Brandon. What changed was my understanding that love and trust are not the same thing. Trust must be earned, respect must be protected, and dignity should never be traded for peace. If my story reminds even one person that it's okay to set healthy boundaries, then sharing these painful memories has been worthwhile. Thank you for listening to my story. Before you go, I'd truly love to hear your thoughts. Did Caroline make the right decision, or would you have handled things differently? Please share your opinion in the comments. And tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. If stories like this touch your heart, don't forget to like this video and subscribe so we can continue sharing journeys of family resilience, forgiveness, and hope together.